Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and I had a viewer make a comment which we need to talk about here. This person said, hey, high carb diets don't work for people who are insulin sensitive. Everyone's different. So let me put on my +5 hat of weaponsmithing, work on skilling up my crafting a little bit, and let's talk about this. All right, this is the sort of topics that do come up when you start talking about low carb diets and you discuss the pros and cons of low carb diets, ketogenic diets, things like that. They come up with stuff like this. And all right, first of all, we do need to note it's not insulin sensitive that's a problem. It's insulin resistance that's a problem. Being sensitive to insulin is an amazing thing. People who have a high insulin sensitivity very, very rarely get cancer, very rarely get heart disease, any of this. So that's a good thing. That should be your goal, is to be insulin sensitive. What she means is insulin resistance. Now, the problem with this line of thought is that they're thinking in terms of, insulin resistance is something you just have. That's like saying that cancer is something you just have, or whatever other damage or lifestyle-induced disease that you've given to yourself is something that you just have. No, it's not. Insulin resistance is something that you develop as a result of many years of a horrifically bad lifestyle. For people who are genetically predisposed to it, you don't just develop insulin resistance as someone who works out and exercises and eats healthy. That doesn't happen. You don't develop it after you start those habits. You develop it, and then you have to use habits to try to undo it. So people need to understand that. That is a good point, and we can get into the problems with high carb diets and insulin resistance, but here's what people need to understand. Insulin resistance is curable. It is lifestyle induced, and it can be removed through lifestyle. If you have insulin resistance and you do not do something about it, and you know you're insulin resistant, if you know you're insulin resistant to the point where you can't eat a high carb diet, the worst thing you can do is not do something about your insulin resistance. Do you know why? You know who gets the highest rate of cancer? People with insulin resistance. All right, you are predisposing yourself to an enormously higher cancer rate of every single type of cancer, just about. The worst thing you could possibly do is say, well, I have insulin resistance, so I'm just going to eat a diet that's tolerable for someone with insulin resistance instead of curing your insulin resistance, because you're not removing the lifestyle-induced disease that you have, and it can have a cascade of negative effects, including making you more prone to other diseases like cancer, everything else. All right, that's your problem. So what do you need to do when you have insulin resistance? And how do you know that you have it? Well, one of the signs that you have insulin resistance is showing signs of prediabetes, hypoglycemia and stuff. Meaning, when you eat a bunch of carbs, if you get low blood sugar and you don't have any explanation for it, meaning, sure, a lot of people get low blood sugar when you way overfeed. You get sleepy on a Thanksgiving feast. But for regular feedings, and maybe you're not on a drug or something that could cause this, and when you eat a high carb meal, particularly a sugary one or higher glycemic index one, you get really low blood sugar, you get sweats, you get hungry, everything else after eating one, 30 minutes or an hour later. Right? That's a sign you're developing insulin resistance. And insulin resistance is part of the steps to developing type 2 diabetes. Well, that doesn't just occur naturally. That's a completely lifestyle-induced disease. So what you need to do, if you have this, obviously going on a really high carb diet might not work for you. But, it's going to depend on the type of high carb diet you follow, because people need to understand carbohydrates do not intrinsically cause insulin resistance. That's something that people need to understand. Not all carbohydrates actually contribute to it, meaning you could go on a diet that's 70 or 80% carbohydrates and never develop insulin resistance. In fact, there are diets that you could put anyone on and they will never develop insulin resistance as a result of that diet. All right, it is about the content of your diet, and it's not even about the fact that the foods are just refined. All right, you could go on all white rice, and again, you see countries where white rice is the predominant staple. Do you see insulin resistance? Do you see type 2 diabetes in those countries? No, you do not. It's not refined grains that causes insulin resistance. It's excessive fructose intake. And excessive saturated fat intake has been associated with it. So when you think about it in those terms, what is it that you need to be avoiding? You need to be avoiding saturated fat in large amounts, and you need to be avoiding processed sugars. I mean, if you have insulin resistance. It's the first thing you need to do. And people will say, well, I'm going to go on a ketogenic diet. Yeah, but ketogenic diets don't reverse insulin resistance. They might help a little bit if they help you lose a bunch of body fat. If they help you lose a bunch of body fat and you're obese or something, they might help some. And they've been known to help with that, but that's not your best long-term solution. What people need to understand is that people who have insulin resistance have been able to lose weight using two different diet methods. They can either do the ultra high carb, all starchy method. Again, Dr. McDougall, I mentioned the other day, perfect example of someone who successfully reverses type 2 diabetes in obese patients. While having them eat an ultra high carb diet, a mostly carb diet. Can totally be done. You avoid fructose. All right, if you're insulin resistant, don't eat any table sugar, don't even eat any fruit. I mean, let's be honest here. If you're insulin resistant already, the worst thing you could do is to put foods into your body that are going to affect that, because fructose is one of the biggest causes of insulin resistance. It has to do with the way the liver metabolizes it and excessive amounts of it over time. And the average person can get away with a fair amount of fructose without any negative effects. But people who are already insulin resistant probably need to cut that down. That means they don't need to be adding sugar to anything. They don't even need to be eating fruit. They need to be eating starchy carbs and veggies. Or you could do an ultra low carb type diet. Now, what I'm going to recommend to people, unless you're planning on doing a ketogenic diet for life, the ketogenic diet would not be the route that I would give someone who doesn't plan on staying ketogenic for life. It wouldn't be my first choice for someone with insulin resistance, because that saturated fat, the large amounts of it, again, this is argued by plenty of dietitians, is that's your other cause of insulin resistance. Well, you're only removing the fructose component, not the other one. So it may not be ideal. If someone wanted to do a low carb diet for a few months while they work on their insulin resistance, going a very high protein one could be the way to go. Now, you people need to understand, if you're on a budget, that's not going to be very viable. It's going to get real expensive. So anyone who's, not at least middle class, you probably don't want to consider that option. I'm just saying, because eating 2 pounds of lean protein and piles of vegetables every day is, for a lot of people could be outside of their budget. But they could follow that. So you're basically, you would be living on lean proteins and vegetables. You could go that route, or you could go the high starchy route. And either way, that's going to help you. I mean, what you will find, though, some people whose insulin resistance is very bad, they might have to go the other route for a little while. You need to get in the gym and start lifting weights. That's number one priority. You have to start lifting weights. You've got to start building muscle mass. You have to start resistance training. That is step number one. That's your biggest one right there, along with getting the saturated fat and fructose out of your diet. Now, some people have reversed their insulin resistance by doing ketogenic diets and lifting weights and losing a bunch of body fat. And then they can switch to a more traditional diet. But yeah, the problem that some people will run into, even on the ultra high carb diet, their appetite's going to be a problem if they're insulin resistant, because their body overproduces insulin as a result of eating carbohydrates. But that's going to depend upon the individual person, and that's going to depend on how much fiber and stuff they put in their diet. Meaning, there are people who, they might have insulin resistance, and they say, well, I tried a really high carb diet, but they were eating piles of white rice while insulin resistant and putting a lot of sugary sauces and stuff on them. I mean, I love sweet and sour sauce on rice, but if you're insulin resistant and you're eating that 3 times a day, see where I'm going with that? You're still putting a bunch of fructose in it. Still putting a bunch of simple sugars on a fairly high glycemic index carb. If you're insulin resistant, white rice isn't so great, particularly not with a sugary sauce on it. So that, people will try something like that and not eat the right foods for a high carb diet for someone who's insulin resistant. They probably need to be eating almost exclusively whole grains and vegetables for their carbs. That means brown rice. That means potatoes, barley, rye, everything whole grains, everything with tons of fiber in it, if they're going to go the high carb route till their insulin resistance is cured. But this, and the reason I say this is that otherwise they're going to get low blood sugar, they're going to have an appetite problem, and they're going to overeat. That's going to be the biggest problem with insulin resistance, because people who are insulin resistant overproduce insulin. They have too much circulating insulin. It drives their blood sugar. Low blood sugar goes low, energy goes down, appetite goes up. All right, energy down, bad. I mean, energy down is bad. You're going to feel bad. You're going to perform worse at work. You're going to perform less in the gym. You're going to do less exercise. Appetite up means you're going to eat more calories. So you're burning less calories and eating more. There's your problem. But it's not necessarily carbohydrates that are causing that. It's the carbohydrate choices people are making, because different carbohydrates do not have the same insulin response. And people need to understand, like this person said, well, everyone's different. Yeah, everyone's different in their insulin response, but you can always improve your insulin response. Meaning, if you go on a very high fiber, high carb diet and you're lifting weights, that will eventually reverse your insulin resistance. You could also do the same thing by eating piles of lean proteins and vegetables and resistance training. You could do that also. If you do either one of those long enough, your insulin resistance will reverse, it will go away, and it will not be a problem. But people need to understand when they say, well, you know, high carb diets are problematic for people who are insulin resistant. Well, yeah, but it's not all high carb diets. And insulin resistance isn't incurable. In fact, if you are insulin resistant and you don't do something about it, you're an idiot. All right, and I'm just going to call that frank. I'm going to call it like it is. Insulin resistance will kill you eventually. It will kill you, and it's curable. So if you know that you're insulin resistant and you don't choose to actively take multiple steps to do something about it, it's basically committing suicide. That's not really much different than picking up a gun and putting it to your head and pulling the trigger. Not a lot of difference. I mean, at the end of the day, both of them kill you. Both of them are conscious choices you make. In practice, a little different, but there's not a lot of difference, really. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I will talk to you guys next time.